All right. So, John Calvin of course, is a major figure not only in the Reformation but in Western civilization, not only in the 16th century, but he's still having a major impact today, and I'm sure that doesn't surprise you at all, as many of us are dealing with the controversies of Calvinism. Um, and as we're going to learn over the next few weeks, what we call Calvinism doesn't always connect to John Calvin himself. All right, and so we need to remember that what we call Calvinism has been developed by his follower Theodore Beza. It's been impacted by his detractor Jacob Arminius. It was codified at the Synod of Dort. There's a lot that we can say about Calvinism, but first of all, we've got to learn about John Calvin. So let's look at attitudes about John Calvin. First of all, this is just a spreadsheet from a magazine, Christian History Magazine. It is my favorite magazine. I have literally every issue, and one of its early issues focused on John Calvin, and the very first thing it talks about is people's attitudes toward him. And Louis Spitz, a Lutheran historian, said that Calvin was one of those strong and consistent men of history who people either liked or disliked. They adored him or they abhorred him. So let's read what some people said, those who adored him. All right, the longer I live, the clearer does it appear that John Calvin's system is the nearest to perfection. C.H. Spurgeon. All right. Here's a Scottish theologian, William Cunningham. Calvin is the man who, next to St. Paul, has done most good to mankind. All right. Philip Schaff is a historian that I respect. He says, taking into account all his failings, all right, we must take his failings into account. But nonetheless, Calvin must be reckoned as one of the greatest and best men whom God has raised up in the history of Christianity. All right, now here's the evaluation made by Theodore Beza, who probably knew Calvin better than anyone of his day. And Theodore Beza said, I have been a witness of him for 16 years, and I think that I am fully entitled to say that in this man there was exhibited to all an example of the life and death of the Christian, such as it will not be easy to depreciate and it will be difficult to imitate. All right, well, yes, difficult to imitate, but I'm afraid that too many people find it easy to depreciate John Calvin. And so here are some quotes from those who abhorred him. Roland Bainton, who is a church historian, he wrote biographies about Martin Luther and Michael Servetus. All right, he said, if Calvin ever wrote anything in favor of religious liberty, it was a typographical error. All right, so not much from Calvin in favor of religious liberty. One of Calvin's neighbors said, better with Beza in hell than with Calvin in heaven. Okay? Here's a Freudian psychologist. It was the fact that Calvin's own character was compulsive neurotic, which transformed the God of love, as experienced and taught by Jesus, into a compulsive character bearing absolutely devilish traits in his practice of reprobation. All right, so this psychologist did not have a good opinion of Calvin. All right, Will Durant was a secular historian. He said, "We shall always find it hard to love Calvin, who darkened the human soul with the most absurd and blasphemous conception of God in all the long and honored history of nonsense." But of course, Will Durant was not a fan of Christianity anyway. Well, here's the last quote. "Calvin has, I believe, caused untold millions of souls to be damned." This from Jimmy Swaggart, who had his own problems, right? Okay. So we just begin with this mixed evaluation of John Calvin, and probably a correct assessment is somewhere in between. Well, we need to talk about the background to the French Reformation in order to understand John Calvin, because even though Calvin's work was done in Switzerland, his origin was in France. And in France, they are experiencing a renaissance, a renewal. They're experiencing humanism, this movement that focused on the individual, this renewal of classic studies, language, art, architecture. So this renaissance is having an impact on France, and particularly at the University of Paris. And so this emerging French Reformation is led by certain humanists. One is a man named Lefebvre. His student was Guillaume Briçonnet. Pardon my French, because I don't really know how to pronounce these words. If Dr. Harsh were here, he could do it. But Briçonnet became the Bishop of Meaux, and so he's a highly placed Catholic bishop with Reformation ideas. And so Briçonnet appointed Lefebvre and Guillaume Farel as preachers and teachers in his diocese. We'll hear more about Farel later on. Well, among the laity, they're beginning to press for reform in the Catholic churches. They're also beginning to tear down the images in the churches. Well, on the opposition, we have Pope Clement VII. And so he's urging the repression of the Reformation. And of course, we would expect that. So Bishop Briçonnet was forced to dismiss Farel and other reforming preachers. But the reform movement spread from Paris to Lyon and Noyon. All right, so these are important cities in France. But the king, Francis I, had been in war with Charles, the King of Spain, later to become the Holy Roman Emperor that we've talked so much about. But in their war with each other, Charles had captured Francis, the King of France, put him into prison, but Clement, the Pope, had influenced Francis's release. And so the King Francis was obligated to the Pope. And so the king is going to suppress the Reformation. Francis's sister Marguerite, however, who is Duchess of Navarre, favored the reform, and so Navarre is going to become a refuge for reformers. So in France, we certainly have a mixed population, some rooting for the Reformation, but much of the leadership opposed to it. So October 17th, 1534, placards began to appear in several cities. They're denouncing the Roman Catholic Mass. Right, so they're calling for an evangelical Lord's Supper, probably similar to what we see taking place in Zurich, Switzerland. These placards, these posters, were printed in Neuchâtel, and that's where Farel and other reformers had preached. All right, so Farel is being associated with the reform. He's connected to this major push for reform among the laity. Now, Francis then began to persecute the Protestants. In France, they're known as Huguenots. We'll talk later on about where that name came from, but for now, it's enough to know that French Protestants are called Huguenots, and Francis, in response to these placards, begins to persecute them with vigor. So, in the space of the next month, 200 arrests are made. Within the next 3 months, there are 20 executions that take place. All right, so the royal government is bringing tremendous pressure against the Reformation in the 1530s. All right, so that gives us some background to what's going on in the background of John Calvin's early life. All right, born in 1509, Jean Calvin, all right, anglicized to John Calvin, born at Noyon, France. His father was a lawyer in service to the Bishop of Noyon. And so his father wanted his son to go into the business of the church. Through his connections with the bishop, he had his son highly placed in the church. In fact, at age 12, okay, at age 12, John Calvin was tonsured. You know what that means? His head was shaved as a sign of his clerical vow. All right, so he joined the clergy at age 12, and he began to receive benefices. That is, salary came to him from a church that he did not pastor. All right? Any of y'all know a 12-year-old? Okay, think about that 12-year-old. Think about that 12-year-old being tonsured for the ministry, being receiving a salary for the ministry. This is the corruption, the abuse, the total confusion in the Catholic Church that something like this would take place. But nonetheless, with the funding from these benefices, John Calvin received an excellent education at the universities of Paris and Orleans. Now, I want to place Calvin in chronological context. All right? We need to see what's going on before Calvin becomes involved in the church. All right, in 1521, Calvin was tonsured at age 12. Remember, 1521 is when Luther took his stand at the Diet of Worms. 2 years after that, Zwingli's Reformation was established in Zurich. So when Calvin was a young teenager, Luther and Zwingli are already establishing their reformations. 1526, Calvin completed his master's degree in philosophy. The year before, Anabaptists began performing believers' baptism. And then in 1527, the next year, the first Anabaptist martyrs died, and a Sattler composed the Schleitheim Confession. So do you see what we've looked at already? Luther, Zwingli, the Anabaptists, their Reformation movements are well established before Calvin really comes on the scene of the Reformation. Now, Calvin is interested in humanism. All right, he's being influenced by humanism at the universities, but somewhere along the line, he begins to pay attention to Luther's writings, all right, and also the writings of Erasmus. His friend was Nicholas Kopp. His friend was elected rector of the University of Paris, all right, which is like the academic president of the university, all right. So Nicholas Kopp delivers an inauguration address, and that address included a number of evangelical overtones, quotes from Luther and Erasmus, all right. So Nicholas Kopp is in trouble with the Catholic leadership, not only in the church, but even the royalty. And so he was accused of heresy, and he was forced to flee to Basel. Now, Calvin was known to be Kopp's friend. All right? Calvin was suspected of having had a hand in authoring this evangelical address. And so Calvin also had to flee from Paris, and he went to Basel, Switzerland. All right, so in Switzerland, then he then really begins to adopt the Reformation as his own. It's probably at this time, either while he was still in Paris or immediately after, while he was in Basel, Calvin became a convinced Protestant. It was at this time that he grew out his tonsure, and he renounced his benefices that he was receiving from this church. Now, Calvin is a much more private person than, say, Martin Luther, and so we don't know that much about what he's thinking during this period of time. But later in his life, as he writes his commentary on Psalms, he writes an introduction that is fairly revealing. And he makes this statement about himself. What happened first was that by an unexpected conversion, God tamed to teachableness a mind too stubborn for its years. For I was so strongly devoted to the superstitions of the papacy that nothing less than this conversion from God could draw me from such depth of mire. Okay? And so, again, this is late in Calvin's life, but you can see the language that he's using here suggests the depth of mire, his sinfulness, and this conversion. We could even say election by God. And so we see that Calvin had this kind of conversion experience that is going to play an important role in his theology of salvation. All right? If you have any questions, don't hesitate to stop me and ask. All right? Let's talk about the Institutes of the Christian Religion, published in 1536. Now, let's think about how significant this book was to the Reformation. All right? Luther, of course, had written a number of influential works. Of course, the 95 Theses, the 3 treatises he wrote in 1520, on and on, work, commentaries, and works that we really didn't even have time to look at. But most of what Luther wrote was in response to a specific need that he perceived in the church or in his congregation. The same thing with Zwingli. His writings addressed specific controversies. Anabaptists hardly had time to write anything at all. And so what John Calvin contributes to the Reformation is a kind of systematic theology, really the first opportunity that a reformer has had to sit down in leisure and to compose a systematic presentation of the theology of the Reformation. And so when we think about the Institutes in this way, we understand why it made such an impact on the Reformation in the 16th century. All right, his first edition was an elementary textbook for the Christian faith. He dedicated it to Francis I. Okay, he's presenting this to King Francis as a defense, as an apologetic for evangelicals who are being persecuted. It's as if he was saying to the king, if you could read this book and know what it is that we believe, then you would persecute us, less you would understand. You would end the persecution. So the Apostles' Creed provided the outline for this book. The first edition was so small that it could fit into a large coat pocket. All right, so the fashion in this day was large great coats with big pockets, and this book was small enough to fit in. All right, now not anymore, right? If you've got the Institutes on your bookshelf, it's probably 2 volumes, at least my edition is. All right, but the opening sentence of the Institutes is, "Our true and genuine wisdom can be summed up as the knowledge of God and the knowledge of ourselves." All right, so the doctrine of God and the doctrine of humanity. All right, so Calvin publishes this book from Basel, and then he goes to Italy, and then he goes back to Paris briefly, but then he wants to go to Geneva. All right, and I'm sorry. Calvin wants to go to Strasbourg, but he's sidetracked along his way, and so he goes to Geneva. Now let's talk about Geneva. Remember that Switzerland is composed of independent cantons that have united together in a confederacy. All right. Zwingli is up in the northeast section of Switzerland. Geneva is in the far southeastern. It's the most southeastern canton in Switzerland. In 1527, Geneva allied with Bern and Fribourg, 2 other cantons, to overthrow the control of the Roman Catholic bishop and the Duke of Savoy. All right, so they can become independent. All right, now Bern was a Protestant canton, Fribourg was a Catholic canton, and they struggled to see who would have the influence over Geneva. Well, in 1535, there's a disputation in Geneva, much like the one in Zurich, and the council decided in favor of the Reformation. Now, the next year, the Catholic bishop and the Duke of Savoy attacked, but Bern, the Protestant canton, sent an army to support Geneva, and they repelled the Catholics. All right, so in May of 1536, the Genevan citizens affirmed the Reformation. Now, this is only months before Calvin appears in Geneva. All right, so the Reformation is a brand new movement in Geneva. But here comes John Calvin. Now, again, he set out from Paris for Strasbourg. All right, his intention is to pursue the academic life. All right, isn't that what we all want? Just to sit under a shade tree and think deep thoughts. Okay? Let me tell you, there's no such job like that. Okay? But that's what John Calvin was looking for. But on his way, he came across a battle scene because Francis I is still at war with Charles V, who's now the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and this battle is taking place along the road. And so Calvin has to take a very long detour down to Geneva. All right, and so he comes to Geneva. He intends to stay there only one night before making the trek to Strasbourg. But who is in Geneva but Guillaume Farel, all right, the French reformer. And he is actually leading the movement of Reformation in Geneva, but he needs help. The word comes to him that John Calvin himself, author of the Institutes of Christian Religion, he is in town. And so Farel looks him up, finds him at the inn, and just grabs him by the lapels and insists that Calvin stay and help with the Reformation. Well, Calvin says, no, 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 you don't understand. I'm going to Strasbourg. I'm looking for a shade tree. I just want to do research and read the Bible and write books. Farel said, if you refuse to devote yourself with us in the work, God will condemn you. Well, Calvin was shook up, all right? Farel had used a threat of God's curse against Calvin, and so Calvin decided that he'd better stay in Geneva. All right, so Farel must have been quite a forceful fella to convince Calvin to stay against his will. All right, so Calvin worked with Farel to organize the church in Geneva with an emphasis on church discipline. All right. Now, I know that we all think of Calvin as connected with predestination, and that's correct. But we need to remember that one of Calvin's other hallmarks was church discipline. And so he had high expectations for moral life among his parishioners. And if one of his parishioners did not live up to Calvin's standards, then Calvin would withhold the Lord's Supper from that person, all right, would excommunicate that person from the Lord's table. Well, what we're going to find out about Geneva is that the citizens may have voted for Reformation, but for the most part, they were interested more in getting out from under the oppression of the Catholic Church and out from under the pressure of the Catholic Duke of Savoy. They're more interested in that than they were in living a moral reformed life. And so when John Calvin comes at them with this kind of expectations and discipline, well, there was a negative reaction. And so there was a party of a political party that I call the Libertines, who banded together and they elected 4 of their membership to be city councilmen. And these councilmen then opposed these preachers and their reform. All right, so we had this popular discontent with the rigidity of the reform. And so finally, 2 years later, 1538, the city council fires Calvin and Farel, removes them from their clerical positions, and they banish them from Geneva. Okay? Now, again, this is over the issue of church discipline. So, Farel goes to Neuchâtel. He's been there before. Calvin then finally gets to go to Strasbourg. All right? Finally gets to go where he was heading all along. So he goes to Strasbourg, and there he meets Martin Bucer. Now, you may remember that we met Martin Bucer before. He was an Augustinian monk, so he was a colleague of Martin Luther's. And Bucer was present at the Heidelberg Disputation, where Luther defended himself to the Augustinian order. Bucer agreed with Luther, and so he resigned from the order and went to Strasbourg, where he instigated the Reformation. All right, so he's the leading reformer in Strasbourg. Now, Strasbourg has become a place of refuge for many French Protestants. Many French Protestants, hundreds, are now taking refuge in Strasbourg. And Bucer needs a pastor for these French refugees. And so he goes to John Calvin and says, I want you to pastor this church. Calvin comes up again with this protest. Oh, no, I'm not here to pastor. I'm here to sit under a tree and think deep thoughts. I want to write books. I don't want to pastor a church. Well, Martin Bucer takes a page from William Farel's a book of persuasion, and he threatens him with God's curse if he doesn't take on this church. And so Calvin then takes on the pastorate for these French refugees. Well, it is in Strasbourg that John Calvin gets married. All right, he takes a wife. And that is an interesting story in itself, and it kind of humanizes John Calvin when we think of him as a single bachelor in need of a feminine touch. All right, and so when he arrived in Strasbourg, he moved in with Martin Bucer and Martin's wife Elizabeth. And this was a happy marriage, and their home was known as the Inn of Righteousness. All right? And Bucer urged marriage for all of his colleagues. He said, you ought to have a wife, Calvin. And so Philip Melanchthon, of course, now is leading the Reformation in Wittenberg. Melanchthon is married, and his marriage was also a happy one. Philip says to Calvin that his wife is never happy unless he's stuffed like a sausage. All right, and so Calvin thinks, it'd be nice if I had a wife who would cook for me and stuff me like a sausage. And so Calvin realized that he needed someone to take care of him, and so he told his associates that he was now in a market for a wife, and he was open to any suggestions. Okay. Now, all right, guys, some of you are single. Some of you will remember being single, and you can remember thinking about, this is what I want in a wife. Well, this is what Calvin wanted in a wife. All right? I'm not one of those insane lovers who embrace the vices of those with whom they are in love. I'm not looking for a fine figure. This only is the beauty that allures me. If she is chaste, if she's not too fussy, if she's economical, if patient, if there is hope that she will be interested about my health. Okay. So he decided, in 1539, he decided that a little after Easter, he was going to get married. All right. He told his friend Farel to prepare to officiate the wedding and set a date in mind. Well, he set the date, but he didn't have a bride. Okay, so they start bringing the candidates forward. The first candidate was a wealthy German woman. Okay, her brother was a strong supporter of Calvin and said this marriage will be beneficial because she can support you in the manner to which you want to become accustomed. All right? The problem was that she didn't know French, and she didn't seem eager to learn French. Okay? And so that marriage didn't work out. All right? Farel had a candidate. She spoke French. She was a devout Protestant, but she was about 15 years older than Calvin. So Calvin didn't follow up on her. A year later, Calvin set another date with Farel, but there's still no bride. Finally says, I've not found a wife. I frequently hesitate as to whether I ought to seek one, but then all of a sudden someone came to mind. In fact, Martin Bucer suggested Idelette de Bure. Now, Idelette had come to Strasbourg with her husband, and they were Anabaptists, but Calvin convinced them to abandon their Anabaptist beliefs and to adopt his Reformed ideas. So then they became friends, but Idolet's husband, Jean, died, and so she is now a widow. So Martin Bucer suggested Idolet and said she's attractive and intelligent, a woman with culture, and a woman of character and quiet strength. All right, so in August of 1540, John and Idolet married. She brought a son and daughter to the marriage, but any children that she bore to Calvin did not survive. And then Idolet died in 1549. By all accounts, their marriage was very happy, and Calvin was distressed when he lost his wife. He never married again. All right, so there's the story of Calvin and Idolet de Bure. All right, while he's in Strasbourg, he writes a second edition of the Institutes of Christian Religion. So far, both editions are in Latin, but while he's in Strasbourg, he writes a French edition. So now he's got a Latin edition and a French edition, so that his fellow Frenchmen can read it. But then something happens that changes the course of Calvin's life and history. Cardinal Sadoleto is a highly placed Catholic, and the Catholic Church is seeking to bring these Protestant territories back into the Catholic fold. And so Sadoleto writes a letter to the Geneva Council attempting to persuade them to revert to the Roman Catholic Church. Well, there's no one in Geneva with the capability to reply to Sadoleto, and so Geneva sends to Calvin a copy of the letter and asks him to respond. Calvin's reply to Sadoleto is really one of the great expressions of the Reformation faith ever written. He writes that the reformers were not innovators in religion. They were seeking to reform the true church. The church had declined under the corruption and abuses of the papacy. All right. Well, Calvin was so convincing that he convinced the people of Geneva that they needed Calvin to be present with them and to return to his ministry there. And so he was invited to return to Geneva. I wrote this quote wrong, but he said he'd rather die 100 deaths on a cross than to return to Geneva. All right, so he really didn't want to go. And honestly, Idolet did not want to go. But he did so. He returned on September 13th, 1541. It's said that he returned to his church, which was St. Pierre's Church in Geneva. He ascended the steps to the pulpit. He opened up his Bible and began to preach from the text where he left off years before. He never made any reference to his absence. He simply picked up where he left off. All right. That's where we're going to leave off. All right. So we will we'll pick it up here. We'll pick up here with Calvin's return to Geneva, and then we'll make our way forward through the rest of his ministry there. All right, we've got 1 minute. Does anybody have a question to ask or a comment to make? All right, very good. I guess it was all very clear. And we really haven't gotten into that much controversy with Calvin yet. So on Thursday, we'll regather at the same time, in the same manner. All right, we'll still be meeting via Blue Jeans. But we'll finish up Calvin, and maybe you'll have some questions then. In the meantime, be sure that you have reviewed the Zwingli and Anabaptist video lectures, all three of them, and be sure that you responded to me. Okie doke. All right, very good. Love y'all. Take care. Bye bye.